Welcome to the Northwood University monthly webinar series hosted by the Northwood University Alumni Department. My name is Julia Damchek, and I will be your host today. We hope everyone had a wonderful holiday and season, and you're enjoying the new year. Today, we are very excited to host our very special guest, Dr. Gad Saad, best-selling author and visiting professor at Northwood University. Today, he will present for 25 minutes, which will allow for around 15 minutes of Q&A. We encourage you to use the Q&A chat box on the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and we will email out the recording to all participants this afternoon, along with a short survey. So we encourage you to check that out as well. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Academic Vice President and Provost of Northwood University, Dr. Kristen Stahauer. Dr. Stahauer will introduce Gad and moderate the Q&A today. Go ahead, Dr. Stahauer.
Well, thank you, Julie, and welcome to all of you who've joined us for this very dynamic webinar this afternoon. Dr. Gad Saad is a best-selling author and influential public intellectual known for applying evolutionary psychology to consumer behavior. He was born in Beirut, Lebanon, and is a survivor of the Lebanese Civil War, and he's become a prominent advocate for free speech and critical thinking. In August 2024, Northwood University appointed him as visiting professor and global ambassador for the Northwood Idea. His 2020 book, The Parasitic Mind, which is here, which is also our OmniQuest for this year, critiques contemporary academic trends and champions intellectual freedom. Saad has gained widespread recognition through media appearances, including the Joe Rogan Experience multiple times, and has over 1 million followers on X. A vocal critic of what he sees as ideological conformity in higher education, Saad emphasizes the importance of free speech, scientific method, and individual dignity. His life experiences and academic work have made him a notable voice in discussions about intellectual freedom and cultural discourse. Please join me in welcoming our friend here at Northwood University, Dr. Gad Saad.
Thank you so much for this lovely introduction, Kristen. I'm so excited to be here, although I wish the weather, I don't know how it is right now in Midland, but in Montreal, I'm reminded of why I want to leave Montreal. But in any case, I'm very excited to be giving this lecture. So let me start the timer so I can adhere to the 25 minutes. So today's talk is largely on the parasitic mind, but I will also speak very briefly about the book that I'm currently working on, Suicidal Empathy. And let me give you the grand story. So in the parasitic mind, what I was arguing is that our cognitive system, our thought processes, could be parasitized by really bad ideas, which I call idea pathogens. And then I complete that story in my next book, in Suicidal Empathy, where I argue that our emotional system, right, we're both a thinking and feeling animal. So what happens when both our cognitive system and our emotional system are zombified? Not good things happen. So today I'll spend much of the time on parasitic mind, but as I said, I will briefly speak about suicidal empathy. Oh, let me just make sure that the thing, okay. So how did I come up with this neuroparasitic framework? Well, it turns out that in nature, there are all sorts of interactions between parasites and hosts. So for example, a tapeworm could parasitize your intestinal tract. A neuroparasite, though, is a parasite that goes to the host's brain, altering its behavior to suit the interest of the parasite. So here's some examples of parasitic relationships in nature. So here you've got a spider wasp that once it stings the much larger spider, it renders the spider completely zombified, and it could very, very calmly take it to its burrow. It lays its eggs on the spider, and then as the offsprings hatch, they eat the poor spider in vivo. And so, for example, I argue that political correctness is exactly akin to the spider wasp sting, right? Quietly and merrily, we go to the abyss of infinite lunacy. Here's another example of a neuroparasite, which can infect, by the way, human brains, but the most classic example is when a mouse is infected by Toxoplasma gondii, it loses its innate and adaptive fear of cats. It actually becomes sexually attracted to the cat's urine, which is not a good attraction to have if you're a mouse. Here's another example of a brainworm that parasitizes the brains of ungulates, deer, elk, moose. And when that animal is parasitized by this particular neuroparasite, it will engage in all sorts of maladaptive behaviors. It will start doing what's called circling behavior. It bobs its head up and down and circles. Even when the looming predators are coming, it can't extricate itself from that behavior. And so once I saw this framework that is prevalent throughout the animal kingdom, I had the epiphany of, okay, I will use the neuroparasitic framework to argue that human brains can be, if you see here, human brains can be parasitized not only by actual brainworms, but they could be parasitized by ideological brainworms, right? So there are all sorts of pathogens that can affect our health, whether it be bacterium or fungi or viruses or parasites. And so what I do in the parasitic mind is I argue that all of these idea pathogens, postmodernism, radical feminism, social constructivism, cultural relativism, identity politics, and so on. Each of these dreadfully bad ideas, all of which were spawned on university campuses, and then they were they, they proliferated across every nook and cranny of society. They end up zombifying our capacity to engage in reason and common sense in accepting reality. And so what I'll do for much of today's talk is offer examples of some of these parasitic ideas. So here is one parasitic idea that comes from diversity, inclusion, and equity, uh, to be contrasted with meritocracy. This is from the University of Waterloo, which is a top Canadian university, very much known for its computer science and engineering degree. So imagine it sort of like the MIT of Canada. In their computer science school, I'm going to read to you what they were specifically looking for chaired professors of the highest level. So this is called the NSERC Tier 1 Canada Research Chair. So this is the endower of these chairs is the Canadian government. This stands for National Science and Engineering Research Council. So it's the most prestigious chair you can have. There are 2 positions open for these chaired professorship. And here's what they're looking for. They're looking for a professor in artificial intelligence, but specifically who self-identify as women, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or two-spirit. And then for position 2, the call is open to all qualified individuals who self-identify as a member of racialized minority. Now, I have a undergraduate degree in mathematics and computer science, and to my great shame, I wasn't aware that what I learned in the mid 80s could have been much better informed had I been taught by a professor who was two-spirit or non-binary. This is what happens when parasitic ideas take over even the esteemed echelon of academia. And in this case, contrary to what people think, no, it's not specific only to some esoteric department in the humanities. This is in mathematics, in computer science, and in engineering. Here is a case also, by the way, I'm just giving examples from Canada, but it doesn't have to be Canada. I could have pulled out a million examples in the United States, although in Canada, we tend to be a bit more woke than the United States. Here's a professor from University of British Columbia who was a law professor who repeatedly kept being denied tenure because she wasn't getting promoted because she wasn't publishing much. A fundamental feature of tenure is that you have to be a productive scholar. But then she is an Indigenous woman who filed a complaint saying that within my cultural tradition. We are an oral tradition. And therefore, this thing called writing is contrary to my culture. And rather than laughing her out of town, it actually went to the Human Rights Tribunal under the argument that for her to have published things would have been contrary to her indigenous culture. Here is when I say at my university, of course, my university today is Northwood University. I mean here my home university. So Concordia University, which is one of the big research universities, 40,000 plus students. Concordia launches a 5-year strategic plan where one of sort of the top mission statement of the 5-year strategic plan is to decolonize and indigenize the entire curriculum. So I could be a neuroscientist, I could be a physicist, I could be an accounting professor. Across all curricula, how can you as a instructor or professor or researcher, how can you indigenize your teaching? Well, my areas of expertise, as Dr. Kristen mentioned, are in evolutionary psychology, consumer psychology, psychology of decision making. I haven't yet found a way to indigenize those areas. I put this up. I unfortunately probably don't have time to give you the really cool storytelling version of this, but it's become sort of part of the lore, the folklore on the internet. It's such a viral story. This is a story that stems from one of my former doctoral students who had just defended his doctoral dissertation. This is in 2002. And then we had gone out to dinner to celebrate, and he warned me that he was bringing a date to that dinner, and that date was a graduate student in postmodernism, women's studies, and cultural anthropology, to which I answered, so the holy trinity of bullshit. But the reason why he was warning me is because he knew that, the conversation can go wild. I said, oh, no, don't worry. Mum's the word. I'm going to be on my best behavior. It's your night to celebrate, which of course was a complete lie, because about halfway through the dinner, I turned to this lady in question. I said, oh, you're a postmodernist, so there are no universal truths, correct? Because, by the way, that's the fundamental principle of postmodernism. There is no such thing as capital T truth. Everything is shackled by our biases, our idiosyncrasies, and so on. And I won't go through the whole story because it would take too long. The first example I gave her was, isn't it not the case that only in the human context, only women bear children? This is not transgender stuff. This is 2002. This is 23 years ago now. That's why I have a photo here of Arnold Schwarzenegger being pregnant. I said, so is it not a human universal that only women bear children? And she looked at me, scoffed at my imbecility, and said, absolutely not. I said, how is that? She said, well, because there is a Japanese tribe off some Japanese island whereby within the cultural and folkloric realm, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting it to the biological realm, that's how you keep us barefoot and pregnant. And so after I recovered from the mini stroke that I had at that level of stupidity, I said, okay, well, maybe it's too controversial for me to say that only women bear children. How about the fact that since time immemorial, only sailors have relied on the premise that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? Is that not true? And so here she used something called deconstructionism. Language creates reality. She said, well, what do you mean by east and west? And what do you mean by the sun? That which you call the sun, I might call dancing hyena. That's why I have a dancing hyena. I said, well, fine. The dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. She said, well, I don't play those label games. Why do I always refer to that story? Because it perfectly captures what happens to a parasitized mind. This was a graduate student at one of the leading universities in Canada who wasn't able to find a common place of understanding with me such that we could agree that only women bear children in a sexually reproducing species, and that there is such a thing called the sun, the star called the sun. If we can't agree on that, you could then imagine how that could lead us down the abyss of infinite lunacy. Here's another example of two idea pathogens that are closely linked. Social constructivism basically argues that everything is due to a social construction. The human brain is born an empty mind, tabula rasa, and it's only socialization that then teaches us all of our preferences. So, hey, there are no innate differences between boys and girls. And this is what I call biophobia, the fear of using biology to explain human affairs. So look how progressive this company is. You see the little boy, he's playing with a doll, and the little girl is playing with a gun. Well, that is an actual set of ads. That campaign failed because universally, boys and girls do have sex-specific toy preferences. And the way that I can prove that, although again, I'm looking here, I'm already halfway through my talk, so I'm going to try to go quickly. This is called a nomological network of cumulative evidence, something that I discuss in this paper and also in chapter 7 of the Parasitic Mind. I can give you evidence from across cultures, from across time periods, from across species, showing you that those sex-specific patterns happen. So I can get you data from vervet monkeys, from rhesus monkeys, and from chimpanzees, showing you that little boys in those species have the exact same preferences as little human boys. So that puts a bit of a damper on the idea that it is all due to social construction. So there is a way by which we can get to a truth by systematically generating a triangulation of distinct lines of evidence. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go through all this, but that's a very, very powerful way to construct arguments to demonstrate the veridical nature of your position. So there is a capital T truth that we can get at. Now, that doesn't mean that science is not provisional, in that what we thought was true 50 years ago, we updated it, right? Science is autocorrective. So it's not a revealed truth. It's true forevermore. But we do operate under the premise that science does have the epistemological capability to seek truth. Postmodernism says no, that's impossible. All right, let's go on. Here's how woke enters the area of medicine. This is the actual oath. So forget about this guy called Hippocrates, where you have to go through the Hippocratic oath. In this one, the students in their white coat ceremony say things like, we will work hard to defeat white supremacy and colonialism and the gender binary, right? Sex, male and female for sexually reproducing species. These are your future physicians and surgeons. They do a land acknowledgement. They say that they're going to fight against the binary, antiquated binary, that they're going to incorporate indigenous ways of healing, that Western medicine has been, parasitized. They don't use the word parasitized, but has been taken over by white supremacy and so on, right? They recognize that this thing is happening on Dakota and Ojibwe land and so on. This is medical students taking this oath. They're not taking the Hippocratic oath. So anyone who thinks that these parasitic ideas are only reserved for, dance theory, feminism classes, no, it's everywhere. Here is your most recent entrant into the U.S. Supreme Court, who didn't have the epistemological security when asked by this senator, define what a woman is. Hey, I don't know. I'm not a biologist. So until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people who had existed on Earth were perfectly able to navigate through the very difficult conundrum of what constitutes male or female. But now, because we are super progressive and we've got a good US Supreme Court justice here who can't weigh in on what constitutes, she can sit in on cases involving men and women, but she can't tell with definitive assuredness what a woman is because she's not a biologist. Here are some interactions. I won't go through all these. Here are some interactions I had with this is the actual photo of a physician who's an anesthesiologist who chastised me on social media for saying that no, men cannot menstruate. And when I referred to some scientific papers that I had published in prestigious journals where I studied how the menstrual cycle affects women's behavior, she said to me, I'm mansplaining her. I don't have the capacity as someone who doesn't have female genitalia to weigh in on something as elaborate as the menstrual cycle. And because she's a physician and I'm not, she's confirming that men do menstruate, unlike my simpleton mind. Here is what we had at Concordia University last year, where we held a one-day scientific symposium on menstrual equity, because menstruation is a human right. I didn't know that in Canada, women were not given equal right to menstruate. So we held a one-day seminar symposium to study how we can have menstrual equity in Canada. This this is the most prestigious anthropological society in Canada and the United States. They ended up canceling a session with 5 female anthropologists who wanted to argue that it is very important in anthropology and in archaeology that we not get rid of the binary, meaning male and female. So, for example, when you're doing an archaeological dig, and you're a physical anthropologist, you can tell if that skeleton is female or male. So it's silly to get rid of this antiquated fixed binary called male and female. That session was canceled in the anthropological meeting because it was transphobic. Here is 3 separate physicians. Here they are. Here are their names, who basically said that this woman, who happens to have a penis and testicles, is absolutely a woman. And they can confirm that because they have the imprimatur of being specialists. In some cases, they are gynecologists. So gynecologists are confirming that some women who have testicles and penises are indeed women. Now I'm going to switch just a bit to talk about suicidal empathy, and then I'll come back and wrap it up. I only have 5 minutes left. I might have to go a bit over. So this issue of feelings versus facts goes back to my earlier point about the cognitive system versus the affective system, which speaks to my next book. In my next book, I argue that, look, empathy is a wonderful thing. That's great. Empathy is part of our evolutionary repertoire so that we're able to have human sociality, right? We're a social species. So it makes perfect evolutionary adaptive sense that we have evolved the emotion of empathy. The problem is when empathy misfires, when empathy targets the wrong targets, when it is orgiastically hyperactivated, right? So you get the types of inequalities such as illegal immigrants coming from uh, who are MS-13 gang members from El Salvador carry more empathy in our hearts and in our compassion than, say, legal citizens or American vets. Criminals are more important than victims. We have to give criminals, never mind a second chance, an 87th chance, because the criminals have already been victimized by a nasty society. So to now put them in prison would be double victimizing them. Squatters, we have to be more empathetic towards them than homeowners. The homeless people we have to be more empathetic to them than the taxpayers who paid to have parks free of, contaminated needles, and so on and so forth. So what I do in this book is I argue that many of the policies that we see as being today disastrous in the West. So take, for example, the current resurgence of the British grooming gangs. Over 250,000 British white girls were raped by largely Pakistani Muslim men, but the police and the government repeatedly said, shut up, don't report this, keep your mouth shut, because we need to maintain group cohesion, we need to maintain community cohesion, and we need to not appear as though we're bigoted and Islamophobic. So empathy is great, but as Aristotle said, everything is about activating something in the right amount, at the right place, at the right time. And therefore, that's the topic of my next book, What Happens When Our Emotional System is Parasitized. The perfect manifestation of both the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy is our noble, almost to be ex-leader. He recently stated that he was going to be resigning. Well, we've sat under his parasitized mind for the past 9 years. Luckily for you, you haven't had to face someone like that, but be forewarned, it can easily shift. I'm going to skip this because it would take a bit too much time. Here, what I want to talk about very briefly, which is something that, of course, Northwood would understand, building echo chambers where it is construed as anybody who has a differing opinion from mine is a form of violence is not a good idea. That's not how you train students to be critical thinkers. And here there's a beautiful analogy from evolutionary medicine, right? Your immune system has evolved to be challenged by allergens. So it turns out, by the way, that kids who grow up with allergens in their environment, say pet dander or on a farm, end up having fewer autoimmune diseases such as asthma than those who grew up in very sterile environments, precisely because your immune system expects to be challenged in order for it to maximally operate, maximally respond to allergens. Well, now the analogy is that opposing ideas are ideological allergens. I develop better arguments if I'm able to be exposed to counter arguments so I can better hone my arguments. So I don't need to be lecturing about this to Northwood. They've already internalized these ideas within the fabric of their DNA. But of course, most universities are not Northwood. And this argument is particularly apropos for most universities. Now, we are starting to see a shift away from some of this lunacy. But please don't think that just because Donald Trump has come in, that all woke stupidity, all suicidal empathy is going to magically disappear. It took 50 to 100 years for this lunacy to take a foot in all of our institutions. It will take a while for us to eradicate them. I'm almost done. This simply shows the ratio of Republican to conservative professors at American leading universities. 108 to 0, 56, these are ratios, 133 to 1. Even the least biased, which is engineering, is still 1.6 to 1, which in other areas of science would be a huge effect. But this shows you the extent to which our universities are tilted towards one particular ideological bent. I'm almost done. I try to stick to the 25 minutes. So how do we save our universities? Let me just read these to you. Number one, we pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. Universities are not there to train activists. They're there to enrich you intellectually. You could study Shakespeare and be enriched. You could study art history and be enriched. You could study pure mathematics. But the goal of a university is not to train little activist warriors. Leave that for some other institution. No knowledge is forbidden if gathered objectively. No more identity politics. No more, collectivism. Celebrate the dignity of the individual. No more oppression Olympics. No more victimology poker and so on. No more coddling of the culture of offense and the ethos of perpetual victimhood. I don't have to indigenize my curriculum, right? I don't try to Lebanese Jewify my curriculum. I'm Lebanese Jewish, right? Evolutionary psychology exists independently of my identity. That's what's beautiful about science. It liberates us from the shackles of our personal identities. Well, not according to my home university, which expects me to indigenize psychology of decision making. A just society is rooted in the ethos of meritocracy. We are not social ants. The reason why I say this is because social ants are communistic. Social ants have a reproductive queen. They have a bunch of soldier ants and a bunch of worker ants. So they are indistinguishable from each other with one reproductive queen. Well, humans are not that. Some are tall, some are short, some are harder working, some are not harder working. The way you create human dignity is by recognizing the value of the individual. And the way you achieve that is through an ethos of a meritocracy. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. Nothing is forbidden from scrutiny. All ideas, beliefs, ideologies are open to criticism, debate, mocking, ridicule, and other forms of scrutiny, right? No more speech codes, no hate speech. Now, don't get me wrong. The First Amendment already incorporates certain provisos. You cannot engage in direct incitement to violence. So you cannot say, let's head off to the corner of Broadway and 7th Avenue, and when the Jews come out of the synagogue, let's beat them up and kill them. But if you want to say the entire cursus of Jewish philosophy is complete garbage, in a free society, you're allowed to say that. Nothing is sacrosanct. And finally, science, reason, logic, and a commitment to evidence-based thinking trumps your preferred ideology, your hurt feelings, and all kinds of fashionable anti-science, faux intellectual gibberish like postmodernism. I went to 28 minutes. Forgive me. I tried to speak very quickly. I will stop sharing and I will turn it over to Dr. Kristen to field any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gad. And I don't know if you can see the reactions, but there's clapping and likes and hearts and all sorts of things floating on the screen in reaction and response to your talk.
Wonderful.
So thank you for that. And we have a number of very interesting questions asked with a lot of perception. So here's one, and you alluded to this a little bit during your talk. Do you see society correcting itself, and that's in quotes, as things go too far? The recent election in the United States said, we've had enough of the lunacy of woke progressivism.
I do, and you're right that I did allude to that, but it's not, it's not Donald Trump comes on his savior white horse and that's it. There's no longer any polio because we've given the vaccine and polio has effectively, officially been eradicated. No. Someone else will come after Donald Trump, and that person might not be as committed to many of the things that he has autocorrected. So what you need is a eradication of a lot of these ideas forevermore, right? So we need to return to a commitment to individual dignity over identity politics. That has to be a non-starter in a place like the United States or Canada. That's what made the West great, right? That's why Martin Luther King, in his I Have a Dream speech, said exactly that. So, no, I don't think that the battle is over, but boy, it's a good first step that Donald Trump won rather than the alternative.
So here's another question that has multi-parts and it gets at some of these dynamics. Does the West stand a chance considering the declining birth rates in Europe, 1.5 children per woman, mass migration of young men who are hostile to Christianity in places like Scandinavia, Germany, France, and the UK, welfare that breeds fatherless children, and anti-American government schooling here? What is the most effective antidote to the pervasive misanthropic elitist propaganda pushed on young people by entertainment channels, major corporations, mainstream media, and the public sector? Lots there to
Wow.
unpack, but you can pick which aspects you believe are most germane today.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. I do tackle things like the declining fertility rate and suicidal empathy. So there is something called the birther movement, which basically, so those folks are so empathetic about Mother Earth. They're so kind, they're so compassionate, unlike all of you degenerates who wish to have children. The most fundamental goal in life for any species, certainly a sexually reproducing species, is to first survive. But if you survive, but then don't reproduce, the genes end with you, right? So life is a two-part game, first survival and then mating, right? That's the whole enchilada. And now imagine if you've got a movement that says, no, 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 the way that I can aspire to be the best human that I can be is to shut off my reproductive imperative because I want to protect Mother Earth from being raped. So there are all sorts of reasons why many of the things that the question asks are happening, but I do tackle those. And to the point of the question, it's the confluence of all of these craziness, the indoctrination in campuses, the indoctrination in popular culture, the reduced fertility rate across the West. Roughly right now, the replacement rate, I think, is 2.17. In other words, you have to have at least on average 2.17 children to replace the death, right? Now, if immigration is replacing fertility from the host society, and exactly to the point of the question, those who are coming in are astoundingly hostile to Western values, then it doesn't take a fancy evolutionary behavioral scientist to predict for you what the long-term trajectory of the society is. That's why I'm not the one who came up with this motto, but demography is destiny is exactly right. This is why you're seeing the kinds of changes and dynamics in the West, for example, when it comes to Jew hatred. If right for many years after I moved from Lebanon to the West, whether it be to Canada or to the United States, I experienced very little Jew hatred, and it was wonderful. It was in the rear view of my life. But then recently, I've seen a massive and exponential growth in Jew hatred in general and Jew hatred directed at me. Well, what could explain that? Well, if you let in hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who come from cultures where, according to Pew surveys, right? Pew is a nonpartisan survey group. When they sample people from those societies, the percentage of people who report endemic Jew hatred varies from 95 to 99% of polled people. Now, let me step back and explain this. If it were 10% of the polled people, you would say, my God, this is a problem. But 1 out of 10 people coming in have genocidal Jew hatred as part of the fabric of their identity. No, it's 95 to 99%. Well, then is it so surprising that you have this massive uptake of Jew hatred in the West? My God, what could explain this? So I'm not sure I mean, each of these factors has a different solution. I'm trying to work on deworming the ideological landscape, right? That's my part. We have to convince women and men that no, it's okay for you to have children. You're not an evil Mother Earth rapist because you want to have children. So there are many different multi-pronged approaches, but you are right. If we don't solve this, the death of the West will happen. Now, it won't happen within our lifetime, but inshallah, another 50 or 100 years, we'll be living in a different society.
There was a follow-up about sharing the source of the survey on anti-Semitism. I'm sure you can do that because
Oh,
it
sure.
comes from the Pew.
It's 2010, by the way. So if you just enter Jew hatred 2010 Pew, you will get exactly that study.
And in fact, there was a question, this is really shifting gears, but did your grad student get a second date with the dancing hyena person?
I don't know if he went on a second date, but I can tell you that he didn't marry her. Let's put it that way.
Okay. That individual also asked another question about where and when does the original idea, such as the bite, occur that then gets reinforced over time and cognitive bias reinforced?
Yeah, great question. So in the parasitic mind, I actually try to address that in the following way. So if you were an oncologist, so a cancer researcher, you might say, okay, well, there are many, many different types of cancers that behave in many different ways, but there is at least one thing that we can agree that all cancers have, which is the unchecked division of cells. So that would be at the most fundamental a similarity across the different cancers. Excuse me. So what I try to do is say, okay, all of these parasitic ideas, whether it be postmodernism or cultural relativism or radical feminism or so on, they're very different, but what unifies them? And so what I came up with is the following. They all start from a noble place. And in the pursuit of that noble goal, if you have to murder truth, so be it. So this is what I call a consequentialist ethic to truth. Whereas I argue that truth should be deontological. Deontological means it's an absolute truth. You have, right? If you say it is never okay to lie, that would be a deontological statement. If you say it's okay to lie to spare someone's feelings, that would be a consequentialist view of truth. Now, so let's take a specific example. Equity feminism is a great idea. It basically says, hey, there should be no institutional mechanisms by which men and women are not treated equally under the law. Well, based on that definition of feminism, most of us in this Zoom meeting would say, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. Then the problem comes along where radical feminists say, well, but in the service of eradicating and squashing the sexist status quo patriarchy, why don't we promulgate the idea that men and women are indistinguishable from each other, that all differences between men and women must be due to social construction, because that could accelerate our fighting the patriarchy. So in the service of fighting what was originally a noble goal, men and women should be treated equal under the law, if we end up raping and murdering truth in that service, so be it. So that's what is common to all of these idea pathogens. It's a consequentialist perspective on how you handle the truth. So transgender activism does the same thing, right? We need to make sure that transgender people are treated fairly. Most of us would say, of course, I subscribe to that. But I don't have to, from this side of my mouth, then say, no, but there are no innate biological differences between men and women. So when it comes to athletic competitions, the 6'4", 280 guys called Gary yesterday, who became Linda tomorrow, has no innate advantage. That's insane. So that's the general framework by which all of these idea pathogens link up.
There are so many more great questions in the
I
Q&A.
can stay longer if you need me to.
I know. I'm going to ask one more, and we're probably going to have to ask for a quick summary, just a headline out of it. And I'm sure, Gad, that you have made many interested in watching for the release of Suicidal Empathy and also picking up your book, The Parasitic Mind. So here it is. What evidence would you provide to those who argue that the appearance of irrational ideas is typical of a conversation among many different perspectives and may not necessarily indicate a lasting shift away from rational thinking?
I'm not sure I follow the key gist of this. Do you want to?
Yeah, so I think they're asking, is this just dialogue and debate, or is this actually a shift away from rational thinking?
No, because for example, postmodernism, which I call the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas, is not just a shift. It's not half empty, half full. That's why I call it intellectual terrorism, right? The 9/11 hijackers took a bunch of planes and they flew them onto buildings. Well, what postmodernists do is they fly planes of intellectual terrorism on our edifices of reason. Because if we can't agree that only women bear children, and if we can't agree that there is a thing called east and west, and that there is the sun that goes from the east and sets in the west, then that's not a shift in perspective. Shift in perspective is, what are the pros and cons of having the death penalty? There are very good arguments on both sides of that equation, but this is much more than that. That's why they're parasitic ideas, right? They drive us off the abyss, off the cliff into the abyss of irrational lunacy.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, it's time to wrap right now. Gad, as always, thought-provoking, enlightening. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you so
Happy
much.
New Year to all, and I'll toss it over to Julia Damchek to wrap things up.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Stehauer, for moderating, and Gad for that amazing, enlightening presentation. Can't wait for your next book to be out as well. Reminder that we're going to be emailing this out to everyone, the recording and the slides. and we'll have a short survey. So please do take that short survey for us. And we hope to see you next month. We do a webinar monthly, and next month it'll be on February 6th, where our special guest will be certified health and wellness coach, Alina Warner. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.